You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, and All Things Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking.
Thanks to the diligent research of historian Christy Hawthorne in early 2020, the Zodiac Killer forums lit up with the prospect of a possible Zodiac murder in Oceanside, California, the third largest city in San Diego County. In the evening hours of April 11, 1962, the body of taxicab driver Ray Davis, who was 29 years old, was found in an alley near 1926 South Pacific Street in the wealthy neighborhood of St. Malo. He had been killed by 2 bullets to his head and back. Ray's body had been dragged from the taxicab and placed in the alleyway before his killer took control of the cab and abandoned it just 1.6 miles northwest of the crime scene at the 400 block of South Pacific Street. The crime appeared to be motiveless, and it seems no money or valuables were taken from the victim. Ordinarily, this crime would have never made its way to the Zodiac community. However, Christy Hawthorne of the historiesandmysteries.blog website unearthed some interesting newspaper articles surrounding the murder of Ray Davis. 2 days before his murder, on April 9, 1962, an unknown man telephoned the Oceanside Police Department and uttered a vague threat to law enforcement stating, "I am going to pull something here in Oceanside and you will never be able to figure it out." This phone call received little attention, but the significance of it would soon be expanded upon by Police Chief William Wingard when he issued a statement on April 16, 1962, revealing the details of a second phone call to police, in which somebody claimed responsibility for the murder of taxicab driver Ray Davis. This time the caller stated, quote, "Do you remember me calling you last week and telling you that I was going to pull a real baffling crime? I killed the cab driver, and I'm going to get me a bus driver next." It was these 2 phone calls and the threats contained within them that sparked the notion of a pre-pseudonym Zodiac killer, possibly living and operating 450 miles south of the Bay Area, just 6.5 years earlier. Another curious feature of the murder was noted when the 1960 novel by Richard Prather was found on the front seat of the abandoned taxi. The book was called Dance with the Dead. Despite these 2 phone calls within a few days of one another, the mystery caller never called again, and the murder of Ray Davis remains unsolved to this day. Obviously, the comparison between this crime and the murder of Paul Stine in Presidio Heights on October 11, 1969, has drawn parallels, especially when you consider the nature of the phone calls and the further threat on a bus driver. Immediately after Paul Stine's murder, in a wealthy district of San Francisco, the Zodiac would threaten to ramp up his campaign of terror in the Bay Area by targeting school buses. There's an insatiable desire to discover the roots of the Zodiac and ultimately unearth the identity of a serial killer who's confounded Zodiac sleuths for over 50 years. But whether some of those roots lie in Oceanside, California, may never be known.
Approximately 200 miles northwest, and just over a year later, on June the 4th, 1963, Robert George Domingos, aged 18, and Linda Faye Edwards, aged 17, had travelled to Canada del Molino on the Santa Barbara coast for a spot of sunbathing, sometime around 3 p.m. Having parked their 1956 copper and black Pontiac alongside Highway 101, they proceeded down the hillside to the remote coastline below. This should have been a pleasant day out for the young couple, who at some point were approached by 1 or more assailants, armed with weapons and cut lengths of rope, who seemingly had the intention of binding Robert and Linda. It is thought that a struggle may have ensued between Robert and the perpetrator or perpetrators, resulting in the young couple fleeing for their lives back up the hill. However, their escape was short-lived, as they were gunned down by 19 shots from a weapon believed to be a .22 caliber long rifle. Robert Domingos was shot 11 times, while Linda Edwards was targeted 8 times. It is thought that one killer then approached the position they fell, stood over them and finished their cold-blooded execution from point-blank range. All the bullets came from one firearm, leading people to believe one assailant was responsible for the murders. But the puzzling aspect of this crime is that the killer just didn't depart the scene. The bodies of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were dragged over rough terrain uphill for at least 30 feet to a nearby shack, where he placed Linda's body on top of Robert's, cutting open her bathing suit with a knife to reveal her breasts. This must have taken immense effort had there been just one perpetrator of this crime, who had to drag the bodies over uneven and rough ground for a minimum of 60 feet. It is then believed the assailant attempted to set fire to the shack, evidenced by scorch marks on the tarpaulin covering. However, there is no way to determine whether these scorch marks are related to the crime. Investigators, who would eventually discover the bodies in the shack after family members became concerned, documented unused ammunition boxes and strewn matches on the ground. It has yet to be determined how the killer or killers arrived and departed the scene, whether the young couple were trailed to the remote coastline, or whether the killer or killers were already at the location when Robert and Linda arrived. Whatever the circumstances of this brutal crime, it has become linked to the Zodiac murders because of its perceived similarity to the attack at Lake Berryessa on September the 27th, 1969, where Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were bound with pre-cut lengths of clothesline before being stabbed repeatedly. The murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards remain unsolved to this day.
2 days prior to the Domingos-Edwards murder, on June 2, 1963, there were at least 2 reports of gunfire on either side of the area where Robert and Linda were soon to be killed. 11 teenagers in total reported 2 bullets whizzing past them as they were standing by their vehicles in a remote area of Gaviota State Park. They had been surfing at the beach that day and later reported that the shooting took place sometime around mid-afternoon. In another incident, 7 miles east of their location, 3 teenagers camping at Tahiguas Creek reported hearing gunshots coming from the beach just south of their camping ground at daybreak. Both sets of ear witnesses described what they thought was the sound of a .22 caliber gun. There are obvious similarities in these events to the Domingos and Edwards slaying, in the fact that the gun used in their murders was reported as being a .22 caliber long rifle. They too were teenagers hanging out close to the coastline. We now have 3 occurrences of gunfire in just under 60 hours, with 2 of the attacks believed to have occurred in mid-afternoon, with 3 o'clock being the approximate time of the Domingos-Edwards murders. The sniper attack at Gaviota State Park on the 11 teenagers occurred almost 3.5 miles west of the eventual murder site of Domingos and Edwards. And the 3 teenagers at Tahiguas Creek, who reported hearing gunshots coming from the nearby beach, were camping almost 4 miles east of the eventual murder site of Domingos and Edwards. Then 2 days later, Robert and Linda were killed in an area literally bisecting these 2 points. The 14 people who reported gunfire, along with Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, were all teenagers. If this sniper was roaming the Santa Barbara coastline, possibly using the railroad tracks to navigate from one location to another, a healthy stash of ammunition boxes, like the ones found in the shack where Domingos and Edwards' bodies were discovered, may have come in useful in his hunting activities. The question that remains: was the sniper in the shack when Robert and Linda arrived at the beach on the afternoon of June 4th, 1963? Did they unfortunately enter the lair of a killer? Or did he happen upon them after they were already there? Soon after the Domingos-Edwards murders, a 17-year-old boy from Lompoc was arrested due to intoxication, and he revealed to investigators that he knew the murdered couple and that he was jealous of Robert Domingos. Law enforcement noted that the boy had a badly bruised hand and knuckles that seemed to be pushed in, consistent with a fight. This was noteworthy because it was believed that Robert Domingos may have struggled and fought with the assailant before being shot. The 17-year-old boy explained to officers that he had been at Refugio Beach on the Tuesday of their murder. That location is 5.5 miles east of the crime scene. Under questioning, the teenager was combative and belligerent with investigators, and was noted to have a previous arrest record.
Johnny Ray Swindle was a radio man petty officer 3rd class in the US Navy. In 1964, his first enlistment was coming to an end, so decided to take some leave from his San Diego duty station and return home to Jasper, Alabama. This is where he married his high school sweetheart, Joyce, on January 18th, 1964. They travelled to San Diego for their honeymoon and rented an apartment near to the beach to spend some time together, fishing, sightseeing and taking walks on the beach every night. Sadly, their honeymoon would end in tragedy when on February the 5th, 1964, 8 months after the Domingos and Edwards murders, John and Joyce Swindle, both aged 19, were enjoying the Pacific coastline alongside Ocean Beach in San Diego, near Narragansett Avenue, when a mystery sniper perched on the cliffs approximately 50 feet away cut their lives short with 5 shots from a .22 caliber weapon believed to be a long rifle. After shooting the young couple from distance, he callously approached the stricken couple and fired one more shot into each of their heads at point-blank range. Investigators found on the ledge of the retaining seawall near the bodies a box of Valentine candy, which they believe was purchased by the Swindles earlier that day. However, it did cross their minds that it may have been a sinister calling card left on the retaining wall by the killer. Despite Navy divers combing the shallow water and investigators scanning the beach area, little in the way of evidence pointing to the killer surfaced, other than 7 shell casings retrieved from the cliff top and beside the bodies of Johnny and Joyce. These murders obviously drew parallels to the previous murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards on June 4, 1963, along with the sniper shootings 2 days before their murders on June 2, 1963. Ballistics analysis showed no correlation between the .22 bullets and casings from the Swindle murders and the still unsolved murders of Domingos and Edwards. Captain Ed DeBolt pondered a reason for the slayings, stating, "There is obviously no indication of motive, unless the missing wallet indicates robbery. There is no triangle in the background of the 2 young people, nothing that would lead us to their killing." Lieutenant William Schenck concluded the possibility of a motiveless crime, stating, "It's entirely possible they were killed by someone they never knew, whose only motive was excitement."
One prominent investigator in the Domingos and Edwards murders was Detective Bill Baker, joining the search for the killer in 1970. He strongly believed in a viable connection between the June 4, 1963 murders and the Zodiac killer attack at Lake Berryessa on September 27, 1969, pointing to the fact that both sets of victims were couples in isolated regions near water, and the killer used pre-cut bindings in both cases, with a gun and knife used in both crimes. It was also noted that .22 caliber ammunition was used at Lake Herman Road on December 20, 1968, the same type used to kill Domingos and Edwards in 1963. While these connections are worthy of investigation, they're extremely tenuous at best. With 366 miles separating the Lake Berryessa attack and Santa Barbara murders, along with 6 years of time, one glaring disparity hotly debated in the Zodiac community is that the bodies of Domingos and Edwards were dragged a total of 60 feet from where they were shot, something the Zodiac killer never did with his victims. The killer or killers of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, by all indications, spent a considerable amount of time at the crime scene after the murders, whereas the Zodiac, other than securing a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, never lingered for any length of time after his killings. It's obviously impossible to totally rule out the 1963 murders of Domingos and Edwards as an early Zodiac crime, but a lot more evidence is required to propose the notion of a fledgling Zodiac killer roaming the shoreline of Santa Barbara some 330 miles south of Vallejo. The day after the Domingos Edwards murders, on June 5, 1963, investigators traveled to Santa Cruz to apprehend 2 teenagers, 16-year-old James L. Coleman and 17-year-old J.C. Reed, for the fatal stabbing of 63-year-old quarry worker Vernon Charles Smith in Lompoc on June 3, 1963. He was killed during the commission of a robbery. The two boys claimed their vehicle ran out of gas, and they asked Vernon Smith for his assistance. Neither of these young men were considered suspects in the Domingos and Edwards slayings, but instead implicated a third person named Sandy in the murder of Vernon Smith. The two young men admitted to their part in the robbery, but claimed that it was this mysterious Sandy who perpetrated the killing of Vernon Smith at San Miguelito Canyon, approximately 3 miles south of Lompoc and 19 miles northwest of the Domingos-Edwards slayings. He was discovered lying on his back in a gravel ditch towards the front side of his green 1951 Willys Jeep pickup. Close by was the gasoline can and fuel they had acquired at a nearby gas station to help the two young teenagers. His cause of death was a knife wound to the back, which penetrated his heart. Coleman and Reed were held without bail by Superior Judge C. Douglas Smith before their arraignment and eventual conviction in a Santa Barbara County court, and they were sentenced to 5 years to life for second-degree murder. The mysterious Sandy was then sought for questioning in relation to the Domingos and Edwards murders. Santa Barbara detectives later stated that they discovered a vehicle stolen by the three youths, inside of which they retrieved some clothing thought to have been owned by the mysterious Sandy. The clothing contained tags with the names Robert Kaufman and William Carr on them, and they believed that one of these names might be the true identity of Sandy. Unfortunately, Sandy has never been identified.
A recent poll on Reddit shows how the Zodiac narrative or Zodiac story about which are the most likely non-canonical Zodiac crimes is not dependent on known evidence, but is based simply on what has gone before. The conventional Zodiac narrative is controlled by a few individuals who essentially dictate what you should believe, and without being aware of it, this narrative is rarely questioned. This is most apparent when looking at the two unsolved cases of Domingos and Edwards in 1963 and the John Hood and Sandra Garcia murders in 1970. The Domingos and Edwards murders occurred close to the coastline in Santa Barbara. They were a couple who the killer shot multiple times before moving the bodies in an attack that likely involved the attempted use of pre-cut bindings 5.5 years before any known Zodiac attacks. The Hood and Garcia murders occurred close to the coastline in Santa Barbara. They were a couple who were stabbed multiple times as they were lying on a blanket in an attack that exactly bisected the December 20th, 1969 Melvin Belli letter declaring he was looking for victims 9 and 10, and the April 20th, 1970 letter declaring that 2 more victims had been added to Zodiac's total. It is patently clear that the Hood and Garcia murders are the equal, if not better, candidate than the Domingos and Edwards murders for being a Zodiac crime. But this isn't reflected in the Zodiac poll on Reddit, in which 67 people voted Domingos and Edwards as possible Zodiac victims, in contrast to the Hood and Garcia murders, which only received 11 votes. Therefore, this result hasn't been achieved by examining the publicly known evidence. It has been achieved through conditioning. This bias is also exhibited in many of the Zodiac books online, where one crime is universally featured while the other is generally ignored. This is the Zodiac narrative that is passed from one generation of Zodiac sleuths to another and is governed by selected advertising. The second example in the Reddit poll is the murder of taxicab driver Ray Davis in Oceanside in 1962. After being shot, his body was dragged into a nearby alleyway before his taxicab was taken by the killer and abandoned 1.6 miles away. Threatening calls were made to the police before and after the crime, with the caller admitting responsibility for the taxicab murder. The caller also threatened to murder a bus driver next. This has drawn parallels to the Paul Stein murder in Presidio Heights, after which the Zodiac killer threatened a school bus, stating he would pick off the kids as they came bouncing out. The Ray Davis murder occurred 6.5 years before any confirmed Zodiac crime, with the victim and taxicab both moved. The murders of Koi Ian Sachau and Choi Fao Saley on a Sacramento highway in 1986 occurred after the Zodiac announced himself to the world, in a crime that mirrored the attack at Blue Rock Springs, and the contested Kathleen Johns abduction, where she was pulled over on Highway 132. The murders of Sir Chow and Sei Lee were possibly claimed by the Zodiac killer in a letter he wrote 2 weeks later to the San Francisco Chronicle. A mystery hitchhiker, according to the newspapers, reported these murders as an accident to police during a 19-mile journey spanning East Nicolaus, Marysville, and Chico. The Reddit poll received 50 votes for Ray Davis as a possible Zodiac crime and only 12 votes for Sir Chow and Sei Lee, despite the fact that the 1986 attack is the equal, if not better candidate as a Zodiac crime than Ray Davis. In both the examples shown, it is not circumstantial evidence driving these conclusions, it's what has been governed by certain outlets in the Zodiac community. The Donna Lass disappearance is third in the poll results, showing how the Pines card mailed on March the 22nd, 1971, not even claiming her disappearance, is enough to rank higher as a possible Zodiac crime than all the previously mentioned murders above. After the murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, their bodies were dragged a total of 60 feet and relocated in a nearby shack where the bodies were stacked on top of each other. The purpose behind this makes little sense, other than to relocate them in a position where the killer or killers can burn the bodies by using the wooden shack as fuel. Does the moving of the bodies this distance tend to suggest more than one perpetrator, and their possible attempted burning imply that the killer or killers were trying to wipe away their identity and hence knew Robert and Linda? And I will just add, but if they knew the couple and had trailed them to their vehicle to the crime scene, they must have known their vehicle would be located just 400 feet from the bodies, negating the notion of burning their bodies to conceal their identity.
Well, you bring up an interesting possibility, whether they knew their killer. I think it's very possible. It was an isolated area and hard to get to them, where I think a lot of people might not know that they would be there that day at that time. Although someone driving by perhaps could have seen the car parked in the middle of the two lanes where it was found, and then said, "Oh, there's somebody down there along the beach." And I think there's a really good documentary out there too. People can go back and watch about their murders, and they really give a good job of laying out the area. There's a set of train tracks that went through and a train running, and then you would make your way across those tracks and then go down to the section of beach where they were killed. Very isolated, very depending on the sound, the way the ocean coming in, the train running could hide sounds of someone shooting down there. So that's just one interesting thing. But as far as the bodies, it makes sense that someone might want to burn them to get rid of evidence, perhaps if they had touched them or wrestled with them or what have you. Now, obviously back in 1963, any killer wouldn't have known about DNA. They wouldn't have known that, hey, I've touched them and I've left DNA. Perhaps they were just thinking maybe they left fingerprints on them somehow. I don't know. But, the best way to get rid of evidence sometimes is to burn it and to set something on fire. Now, one person could have certainly dragged both bodies that distance and stashed them and tried to burn them. But it would have been hard work, going once and then coming back and doing it again. And then the whole time you've got to wonder, is someone going to walk up on me and see me in the middle of this? But two people brings up an interesting possibility. Now, one thing we don't know, because there's not a lot of information out there, because the police have been very tight-lipped about releasing reports and stuff, is about footprints, what tracks were found there and what tracks weren't. So the police might be able to determine how many people attacked Robert and Linda and determine how many people, walked along that beach. If they could identify Robert and Linda's prints, and then were there one or two other sets of tracks there. So that, unfortunately, we don't really know a lot of that. Although there's a rumor, unsubstantiated, that one of the prints found there was a wing walker print, which is why so many people believe that it's definitely Zodiac there. But the one thing we definitely know about Zodiac is he never, as far as we know, in any confirmed crimes, moved bodies, unless you count Paul Stein, where he manipulated him a little bit in the front seat and tried to pull off some of his shirt. So that would be a little bit different than Zodiac, unless Zodiac was a young attacker then and did things differently and then later on changed his MO a little bit. But it certainly seems like there's a good possibility that more than one person could have been involved and may have known Robert and Linda. And just one last thing I'd like to point out. In the weeks leading up to them being killed, there were some sniper incidents in the beaches in that area. And different people reported being shot at while they were on the beach. So I sort of find that interesting, and I would tend to think that at some point, a sniper on the beach might have decided to go down closer to people and attack them up close and personal. And I would think that the person that was doing that sniper shooting at people on the beach is probably the same person that killed Robert and Linda, because that would be too much of a coincidence in my mind.
Today, we know about dental x-rays being used to identify bodies. But do you think people in 1963 were familiar with this concept as they are today?
That's a good question. I think they definitely, and a lot of the old cases I've covered, I think dental examinations were one thing that they did have, at least back in the 70s. And I would have to think the 60s as well. You know, they've been using fingerprints and I assume dental charts and things like that, dental comparisons. I would guess that those were back in the 60s too, although I haven't, looked that up to see when they started doing that.
Because it could suggest the murderers of the couple were inexperienced, thinking that just by burning the bodies, they're hiding their identity. But what if the bodies were not moved for the purpose of putting them in the shack to burn them? What other purpose could be gained from moving two bodies 60 feet?
Well, you never know what a person that's capable of doing that is thinking. Maybe it was some kind of, just playing devil's advocate, maybe it's some kind of sacrifice or ritual that they're burning them, almost like a funeral pyre or something like that. I don't know. To me, it seems like it would be to cover up evidence, to burn evidence, to get rid of it. But to your point, it seems obvious that when their car is found, they're going to eventually identify and figure out that these two burned bodies are Robert and Linda, since their car's parked right up on top. So again, could have been spur of the moment. They weren't really thinking about the car parked up there. They just wanted to get rid of the evidence or make it harder to identify them. And I think either way, it failed regardless. And the fact that it failed, that they couldn't really light it on fire, may show that it wasn't pre-planned. If they were planning on killing someone and burning them and getting rid of evidence, they might have brought gasoline with them, something like that, to really set something on fire and get it going. But the fact that they sort of made this impromptu fire that didn't really burn properly maybe makes it seem like they weren't planning on doing something like that. And it was a last second thing that they did.
The biggest evidence that it probably wasn't pre-planned was that there were unspent ammunition boxes discovered in the shack. They were discovered to be .22 caliber Western Super X sold at the nearby Vandenberg Air Force Base, but not exclusively. If this ammunition is connected to the bullets used to kill Robert and Linda, doesn't this suggest that the young couple likely walked into the killer's lair rather than being targeted by the Zodiac killer, who wouldn't have carried boxes of ammunition to the crime scene, different to the marauder he would eventually become in the Bay Area?
Well, I think it's impossible to really know if they sort of walked upon him or he came upon them. I mean, technically, and I don't know what the rules were about like target practicing. I know a lot of things back then were a lot different than they are now, but maybe he was going down there to target practice or do some shooting along the beach there, and they walked up on him, or they were already there and he was going down to do some target shooting. We don't know, but he could have easily had the ammo in his car because he was transporting it back and forth after he bought it, or going shooting wherever he was shooting and just saw their car there and randomly went down. and said, I'm going to take my gun and grab these shells and head down there and see who's down there. I think it's impossible to know how things played out as far as how they came upon each other.
You mentioned the sniper attacks. They happened either side of the Domingos and Edwards murders. They were both within 4 miles either side, one at Gaviota State Park and one at Tajiguas Creek. Do you think that is much more likely to be the explanation behind the murders of Domingos and Edwards?
I tend to think that they're connected. I just find it hard to believe because, if you're going to start shooting at people, that shows a very dangerous person. I think it shows someone that's capable of killing someone, because if they had struck someone, that shows me that they're capable of harming them. So I could see an attack where they're going to do the same thing and just sort of shoot at them, but then they get the urge to walk up closer to them and have some interaction. Again, since we don't really know how things played out and how the interaction came between them and their killer, we're just speculating, but I could definitely see an instance where the sniper attacks were connected to that, and it sort of, the person graduated from just shooting at people to wanting to actually go down and get close to them and maybe shoot them in person, or maybe wasn't planning on shooting them, and Robert tried to defend them and the person shot him out of panic, and then he shot Linda. But it seems from the evidence that, it was something where Robert was tied up by Linda and probably at gunpoint, and in the middle broke free and probably tried to fight off the attacker, and that's when the shooting began. And I think that's why a lot of people compare it to Lake Berryessa, because it does seem as if it played out quite like that, where the female victim was made to tie up the male victim at gunpoint, and then who knows what his plan was after that. Maybe if everything had gone well, he would have pulled out a knife and stabbed them. We don't know. But the point up to when the shooting began seems to have played out like Lake Berryessa.
Yeah, the pre-cut bindings seem to go against a random sniper on this occasion, doesn't it?
Yeah, this seems like someone that had something in mind. They had a plan in mind, and they came prepared. Although, again, how prepared? If they wanted to burn the bodies all along, they might have brought a can of gas or something like that. So maybe they were only halfway prepared, or they weren't planning initially to burn the bodies and decided to at the last second. But you don't bring... I don't think most people are going to be carrying around pre-cut lengths of material at random. I think that shows that they had a plan and they tried to carry it out.
Now, in the introduction, I questioned why the Zodiac community believes certain crimes to be connected to Zodiac as opposed to other crimes, which I believe are equally viable because of the evidence presented in each case. Now, the John Hood and Sandra Garcia murders on February the 21st, 1970, were within the Zodiac timeline, matching the claims of the Belli letter that he was seeking 9 and 10 victims. They were killed just 30 miles east of the Domingos and Edwards murders. The young couple was stabbed on a blanket overlooking the water, just like Lake Berryessa. The location of the Hood and Garcia murders was much more accessible to somebody just trawling an area compared to the secluded area of the Domingos and Edwards murders. Why, from the standpoint of the Zodiac community and Zodiac book authors, is the Hood and Garcia murders routinely overlooked? I don't believe either of the crimes are the Zodiac killer, but I see little, if any, difference between these crimes.
Well, we don't know, again, what played out in the Hood-Garcia case, and if they were approached with a gun and subdued, and then the stabbing began. And, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember any pre-cut lengths of rope being involved in their murders. No. So that's a difference. That might show something that was more spur of the moment, not as well planned out. If I'm not mistaken, I know some people have tried to connect Manson and his family to their murders, different Manson followers being involved, and I think they were in that area around that time. The issue is, as you get further away from, if this had happened 2 miles from where Robert and Linda was killed, that might be something, more to consider because it'd be so close. But once you spread out 30 miles, you're really covering a lot more ground, and there's a lot more chance you're getting closer to the Los Angeles area, to other more populated areas. So there's a greater chance that you're going to have other killers, and you're going to have an overlap of crimes that might have some similarities. One crime, if I'm going to compare it to Robert and Linda as possibly being connected, are the murders of the Swindles. And I think that one, obviously, because you have the shooting aspect, that matches the Domingos Edwards murders, whereas the murders of Hood and Garcia are stabbings. But again, for all we know, the persons that killed Domingos and Edwards and the Swindles, maybe they eventually were going to use a knife as well, and things didn't go according to plan, and they just wound up shooting them and nothing else. But it's interesting. Any couples that were attacked on beaches from that time frame, it's definitely worth considering them as possibly being connected.
Well, the Swindles brings me on to Michael Cole, who recently released his trilogy of Zodiac books. Michael is a well-respected member of the Zodiac community and puts great credence in these early crimes. He noted that Johnny Ray Swindle may have had his wristwatch removed by the killer, with Johnny having done some painting earlier that day. He considered a link to the Sherry Joe Bates murder because a wristwatch was found near the body of Sherry Joe with white speckled paint on it. What are your thoughts on the Swindle murders as an early Zodiac crime? And do you think this is a possibility, or is there a greater likelihood the Swindle murders are related to the June the 2nd, 1963 sniper incidents?
Well, again, as far as MO, the shooting from a distance, because the Swindles were killed, initially shot from a distance, and then the killer walked up closer to them. So that sort of lines up with a sniper that's shooting from further away and then possibly getting closer. And I hadn't heard the wristwatch thing. That's interesting. How interesting would that be to connect, throw it down at Sherry's crime scene, and when it's from another crime scene in San Diego? That would be pretty interesting. But as far as that, the MO, there's definitely the similarity of the attacks on both couples. So I could see why he would put some strength in that Swindle's case being connected. I should point out that I corresponded with a cold case detective in the Swindle murders, and they actually had a pretty strong suspect. They didn't share the person's name with me. They didn't share why they thought they were a suspect, but they did have a suspect. And I'm going back a while, so I don't remember the entire conversation, but they didn't, I guess, have enough evidence to prove that they had done it. Now, the good thing about some of these cases, and maybe even Robert and Linda's case or the Hood Garcia case, we don't know, is that we're seeing a lot of cases solved now with DNA and genetic genealogy, where they can take evidence that has the killer's DNA, and if it's been properly stored and they have enough of it, they can generate a profile and upload it to a public database, find relatives, and then eventually track the family tree to the right person that did the crime. That would be great to see in any of these crimes, the Swindles, Hood Garcia, or Domingos Edwards. If they have DNA that's usable and they can do that, it may be possible even after all these years to see some outcomes, and then we would finally know if any of these are connected.
Zodiac researcher Soren Korsgaard mentioned what you just said, that he believes all these early crimes are the Zodiac killer. He said that in the case of Domingos and Edwards and the Swindle murders, like you've just mentioned, the killer took shots at distance and then approached them for the final coup de grace. Both crimes involving .22 long rifle ammunition. What are your thoughts on this, bearing in mind that .22 ammunition, I believe, was extremely common ammunition in America then and now?
Yeah, the .22 caliber ammunition is it's cheap, number one, and it's readily available. So I think that in itself is not as big a deal as maybe the type of ammo. If you start getting closer to type, if they could establish that, the Domingos Edwards case was the same gun that was used in the Swindles murders, for example, which it wasn't. I think I can't remember the caliber that was used in the Swindles murders, but it wasn't a .22 caliber. It was a Remington rifle of some sort, but it wasn't 22 caliber. But if there had been a connection where the same type of gun, the same make and model was used, or the same ammo, and specifically the same ammo from maybe the same block sold from the same location, that would be really compelling. But I think there's enough differences in particular in the murders of the Swindles and Domingos and Edwards to make you say they could be two different people. But the one was definitely not a 22 caliber, whereas Domingos Edwards was. But again, they could be the same person, just using two different guns. We won't know that unless the cases are solved.
Do you tend to dismiss these early crimes as Zodiac, or do you think there's a real possibility they may be?
Well, I know the authorities in the Domingos Edwards case are confident that Zodiac was the killer in that case. Again, we don't have all the evidence that they have access to, so we don't know why they thought that. And recently, I haven't heard that. They're not really high on running around saying it's Zodiac. On the official Zodiac kill counts and victim counts, the Domingos Edwards are not listed there. So maybe, Santa Barbara may think it's Zodiac. Maybe the other jurisdictions like Napa and Vallejo and San Francisco, maybe they don't think it's Zodiac, so they haven't officially included Domingos Edwards there. I think the one thing we have to keep in mind is California back in the 60s and 70s had a lot of really bad people running around doing a lot of crimes and a lot of killings. All kinds of serial killers, all kinds of dangerous people. For as beautiful a state as it is, it's a big melting pot that attracts a lot of people from all types of backgrounds and all across the country. So, you could have any number of different bad guys operating at one time in different areas there. And we know from some of the serial killers that were around that was the case. There were a lot of bad people operating there at the same time. So it's easy to just look at two crimes that are similar and say, okay, one person may have done it, but in reality, unfortunately, there were more than one bad person at a time in that area.
I know Bill Baker believed the Domingos Edwards murders were Zodiac related. So one has to assume that he must have knowledge of stuff that we don't know. Otherwise, I can't believe personally he could connect this to the Zodiac on the limited pre-cut bindings and similar ammunition. That seems a bit weak.
And again, you're right. You hit the nail right on the head. We don't know what he knows. So we can't really come to a full conclusion without access to what he has. But if it was found that there's a 10.5 wing walker found track left there at that crime scene, that would be pretty powerful. That would be hard to ignore, because then you could add it to the fact they were attacked and, the female victim was made to tie up the male victim with pre-cut lengths of rope. That would all line up. That would be very powerful. But we just don't have access to everything he has. But the MO seems to match Lake Berryessa pretty closely. With the exception of trying to burn the bodies. Obviously, we know that no attempt was made to burn, Cecilia or Brian at Lake Berryessa. So that part is where it changes. He just walked away from there. So interesting possibility. I just don't think there's enough there to solidly say that they're connected. But again, we don't know what Baker knows. So maybe he has more information that would make him believe that.
A year before the Domingos and Edwards murders, a taxi cab driver, Ray Davis, was killed in Oceanside by 2 shots. The only difference to the Stein murder was the taxi cab was moved about 1.5 miles away from where the shooting took place, and his body was found up an alleyway. Now, this was recently discovered by Christy Hawthorne, who presented this, and the most compelling thing she found was the fact that threats were made to the police before the murder, and then an admission after the murder that he was responsible for the killing of Ray Davis. What are your thoughts on this crime?
Well, anytime you have someone that's mailing in threats corresponding with the police, that's pretty rare. Most killers don't want to be involved in contact with the police. They want to avoid them. So anytime you have someone that's reaching out for publicity or trying to hound the police or taunt them, I give that a little bit more credence. But as far as the cab murder itself, a lot of cabbies were killed in California. I don't know, I shouldn't say a lot, but there were, if you look, you can look up a numerous amount of cab drivers that were killed. If, for example, there was one that was killed in San Francisco shortly before Paul Stein, and I can't remember the details, but I think he was placed in a trunk, and it was in the general area of Washington and Cherry, in that area of San Francisco. And some people thought it was maybe a test run for killing Stein. And I think there was cases of cab drivers being abducted and not killed, but put into cabs. So cab drivers, unfortunately, are easy targets. You're usually sitting behind them, so they immediately, if you pull a gun or a knife on them, they're at a real disadvantage. They're carrying cash. So they seem like easy targets to attack if you're going to rob them or you want to do something like that. If you look at Ray Davis, he differs from Paul Stein in the fact that, he was killed, dumped, and his car found someplace else. And while the taunting is similar to Zodiac, that scenario of dumping his body someplace else and moving his cab does not match Zodiac. As well as, as far as I know, there was no piece of his clothing torn off. If there's a piece of his shirt cut off and mailed to police, that would be super powerful in my opinion, but I don't think anything happened with that. So he could be, well, on the surface, it seems like it could be Zodiac. I just also know that cab drivers were relatively easy targets for different kinds of criminals. So I don't put a lot of weight into it unless something comes out that's really damning or earth-shattering.
After reading about the Ray Davis murder, I went looking for other taxicab murders that might be closer to the Bay Area, or at least more relevant to the Zodiac killer. Now, in 1954, 8 years before the Ray Davis murder, yellow taxicab driver Conrad Favreau was gunned down by one shot to the back of his head in Los Angeles. He was found on the sidewalk, separated from his vehicle, not too dissimilar to the murder of Ray Davis. The street he was murdered on was Bonnie Bray Street. Does this street bring back memories, Mike?
It doesn't, but I bet you have the answer, and you can expand on that.
I just seeing if you remembered it, because
it sounds familiar, but I'd love to hear your explanation of it.
I mean, let me say before I mention this, I don't think either of these murders are the Zodiac killer, but it's a bit of that synchronicity again. Right, this Bonnie Bray Street was the street Doreen Gall and James Sharp lived in 1969 when they were murdered just 1 kilometre away. This means we have a taxicab murder on the same street. A possible Zodiac letter was found in the belongings of Doreen Gall. At her previous residence in Albany, New York, her residence was only 500 metres from the Albany Medical Centre, which became the focus of another Zodiac letter. More strange coincidences.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head too with the synchronicities. There's a lot of that in this case. Again, I think if you look at before and after, you'll find lots of different cabbies that were killed in things in ways that maybe you could connect or find similar locations because they were such easy targets all along from the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think today, it's been a while since I've been in a cab, but I think they have a lot more, things to separate the driver from the passenger, cameras, things like that they didn't have back then. So I think it's not as common today to attack cab drivers because they have things in place to make it more difficult to get away with it. But I think back then it's easy to find a lot of different cab driver murders that have some element that they all share.
Yeah, I just think it's a coincidence, but it did make it curious because I was looking for a cab driver that was murdered that had some relevance. And because, we had a Zodiac letter and a murder of a taxi cab driver in the same street, I find that rather curious. But again, we get lots of these coincidences.
Yeah.
So on June the 5th, 1963, investigators traveled to Santa Cruz to apprehend James Coleman and J.C. Reed for the fatal stabbing of Vernon Charles Smith in Lompoc during a robbery. They claimed that they weren't responsible for his murder, but it was somebody called Sandy who perpetrated the murder of Vernon Smith in San Miguelito County, approximately 3 miles south of Lompoc. Why has this crime garnered any attention with respect to the Zodiac killer? And what's your take on the murder of Vernon Smith?
Well, I guess the interesting thing, the first thing we need to think about is those two, young kids that were charged in the crime, they both seem to have the same story. Now, I don't know. A good detective job would have been separating both of them and asking them questions separately and seeing if they gave the same exact account versus questioning them together in person where they could feed off each other's story. So I don't know if that was done. I would hope that it was done. And if they both independently came up with the same exact story about Sandy and the same details, that would make it more credible that he was a real person and really there, as opposed to them just wanting to blame some phantom kid that did the killing and they were just with him. It's hard to know if that was real, but it seems like the police took them seriously, that the police really believe there was a Sandy because they went looking for one. And if I'm not mistaken, didn't they investigate a kid named Robert Bell? His name escapes me. It might be Robert Bell. It's been so long that they investigated as being Sandy and then they let him go. So I think they definitely thought there was some reason to believe that Sandy was a real person. And I think where he came into Zodiac circles is because it happened in Santa Barbara around the time of the Domingos Edwards murder. He had generally fit the Zodiac's description, although he was a little bit younger, thinner than Zodiac. But I think he mentioned being from San Francisco. That gave credence to people thinking he could be Zodiac. So there's a few different reasons to suspect that he may have been real and may have played a role in the crimes and perhaps also played a role in Domingos Edwards murders. And then some people think he later on could have become Zodiac. One other thing, and again, it's been so long since I read about this, but I seem to recall that he mentioned stealing a 22, or he did steal a 22 caliber gun. So that might be a reason to suspect him in the murders of Domingos and Edwards as well.
Inside the vehicle they stole, they did find clothing with the names Robert Kaufman and William Carr, one of which the investigators believe might be the true identity of Sandy.
Yeah, and, I had spent some time looking for those names, and I did find a couple interesting people in the Bay Area with those names, but nothing solid, and I assume the police could do a much better job than I could of finding names and backtracking those people and maybe questioning them. But it could be a red herring, if one of these names was not his name and they were searching for people by that name, then he's, all these years he's been getting away because they're looking for these other names. If he had borrowed those clothes or stolen them and was just wearing them because that's all he had and sent them down on a wild goose chase, then they might not have any clue as to what his real name is. But if he went by Sandy, there's a couple names that people are often nicknamed Sandy with, and I'd have to go back and see what they are. But I did a little bit of research and found out that some boys were nicknamed Sandy when they had particular first names. So maybe Sandy is a clue to his real identity, someone that matched that description and went by Sandy. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Mysteretical. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Hey, I'm Lynn, and this is my co-host, JP.
Hey there. We're Mysteretical, and we love a good mystery. Oh, right. It's Each week, we come through a mystery and its theories and discuss some of our own.
That's right. We give original thoughts on mysteries around the world, large or small.
Murder, mayhem, aliens, or the bizarre.
Tune in every Tuesday wherever you listen to podcasts.